When we last left China in Era 3, the Qing dynasty was essentially collapsing from within, and it all came to a screeching halt in 1911. Now they enter the 20th century after this abdication with a new republic. In 1912, led by nationalist Sun Yat-sen, the new Republic of China was declared. As leader of the Kuomintang, the Kuomintang are the nationalists. Sun believed that a modern China would have a liberal legal system and take advantage of its own resources so that China could take its place among the major powers of the world. The Chinese were already dealing with early Japanese aggression in the 1910s, with Japanese rule over Taiwan, and they balked when they received the former German possession of Shandong Peninsula to honor their alliance with Britain and France during World War I. On May 4th, 1919, university students gathered in Tiananmen Square to protest Japan's presence and appeal to the government to restore the honor of China. This May 4th movement led to strikes, meetings, and a general boycott of Japanese goods. It did signal a rise in Chinese nationalism, but the government was powerless to do anything about it. So as we enter the Republic, there are still struggles that they have to deal with. External enemies, namely Japan. Now, the fall of the last Chinese dynasty meant that traditional warlords in the countryside could grow in influence unchecked, and this is somewhat of a continuity in Chinese history. Each warlord had their own private army to terrorize the countryside. So to regroup, Sun went to Guangzhou, where the Kuomintang was being rebuilt by his brother-in-law, the man on screen, Chiang Kai-shek. The Kuomintang defeated the warlords by 1927, but Chiang was more of an authoritarian ruler, and Sun's death in 1925 also meant the end of his idealistic emphasis on reform and a shift towards militarism and corruption. Simultaneously, the Chinese Communist Party formed in Shanghai in 1921. Chiang had made a tactical alliance with the Soviets in the early 1920s, but turned on them by 1927 after he felt more secure in his power. Kuomintang soldiers and their goons turned on communists living in coastal cities, killing thousands of them. So as we set up the formation of this Communist Party, we acknowledge the reality of how it all began. Mao Zedong emerges as the leader of this party, and, Mao is first and foremost a peasant who never forgot his roots, and he firmly believed that the soul of China resided in the countryside. This is where the Chinese really departed from the roots of Marxism. The Bolsheviks found their audience in the industrial working class, while the Chinese began to look towards the peasant villages for support. The peasants didn't immediately rise up as they had done in Russia, but after years of land reform, guerrilla warfare, and the creation of a communist military force to protect liberated areas, the Communist Party ultimately began to gain support. The Communist Party recruited women to their cause by outlawing arranged marriages in communist-controlled areas. They made divorce easier, and they granted women the right to vote and own property. Women's associations promoted literacy and encouraged discussion on women's issues. However, traditional resistance from rural peasant villages caused the Communist Party to alter these early rules. For example, no divorcing men on active duty. Land deeds were given to the male head of family, things of that nature. As the 20s give way to the 30s, really the low point for the Chinese Communist Party comes in the mid-30s. And you can see the dates on the screen, when they were chased around rural China by Kuomintang forces. All in all, they crossed 18 mountain ranges, 24 rivers, and covered 6,000 miles. 10,000 communists began the journey, and 7,000 ended it. But these 7,000 became the core supporters of the CCP after the Long March. It was after this time that they consolidated their power in the countryside. And Mao was even interviewed by an American journalist named Edgar Snow. And Edgar Snow's Red Star Over China remains the premier example of early years of communism in China. Now, during World War II, the two sides agreed to a ceasefire. The Japanese occupation actually destroyed much of the Kuomintang's power, and they became dependent on warlords in the interior. The Communist Party grew from 40,000 strong in 1937 to about 1.2 million by 1945. And the People's Liberation Army had about 900,000 members, with 2 million more militia troops. The support came from the tenacity with which the Communist Party resisted the Japanese, with their guerrilla tactics, while the Kuomintang really seemed to be more interested in rooting out communists. They encouraged peasants to speak out in public meetings and to settle their accounts with their landlords. So really they resolved two issues. The communists are dealing with foreign imperialism and addressing the realities of peasant life. And, World War II is not going to last forever. Once it ends, the two sides are going to be back at it again.